Your best friend's wedding invitation arrives. The day she's dreamed about for years. You're holding the cream-coloured card in your hands, reading her joy in every carefully chosen word, and you know you cannot go. Not because you're sick, not because you weren't invited, but because you're wearing black. Because society has decided that death still clings to you so powerfully that your presence at a celebration would contaminate it. This was life for Victorian widows. Tonight, their story. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Get comfortable, dim those lights, let yourself settle in. If this is your first time listening, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and I love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one. Tonight we're stepping into one of history's most controlled experiences of grief. The 2-year mourning prison that trapped Victorian widows. To understand why a widow couldn't attend her niece's wedding, you need to understand Victorian death. It wasn't tucked away in hospitals like today. It was everywhere. Cholera could sweep through a neighbourhood in weeks. A healthy husband could be dead from typhus in 5 days. Children died so often that families delayed naming babies until they survived their first months. Death was intimate, domestic, and constant. Against this backdrop, grief wasn't something you filed away and moved on from quickly. Then Prince Albert died, December 14th, 1861. Queen Victoria was 42, married 21 years. Her response echoed through every household in Britain for the next 40 years. She plunged into mourning so complete, so visible, that her subjects couldn't help but follow. Her court wore black. Her household wore black. Etiquette manuals rushed to turn scattered customs into rigid law, and no position in this new system was more demanding than the widow's. 2 full years of measured grief. 3 stages. That's how Victorian mourning worked. First stage, full mourning. 1 year and 1 day of complete social death. A widow wore only black parramatta covered in crepe, that stiff, scratchy fabric treated with chemicals to absorb zero light. Even her undergarments had black ribbon sewn on. Her veil, 6 feet of double-layered crepe, so thick it was described as blinding and stifling. She couldn't attend anything. Weddings, dinner parties, theatre, all forbidden. She was erased from public life entirely. The crepe itself tells a darker story. One British company, Courtaulds, held a monopoly on mourning fabric, 30% profit margins during the boom years. But here's the twisted part. The dyes were toxic. Aniline black, made from coal tar, mixed with arsenic. Women were getting poisoned by their grief uniforms. Medical journals by the 1880s were screaming warnings about arsenical poisoning from black crepe dress. The fashion magazine The Delanator called mourning veils veritable instruments of torture, literally made sick by sorrow. Weddings were especially forbidden. Practically, a woman in black was a visual intrusion at a celebration. But deeper than that, Victorians believed widows carried something of the grave with them still. An aura of death that hadn't fully dissipated. Bringing that into a wedding wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. Bad luck that could threaten the couple's happiness, their fertility, even their lives. Folk memory ran deep. Death was contagious. Joy needed protection. The widow was contamination, waiting to happen. For working class women, this system was financial devastation. A working class funeral could cost £5 when annual salaries were 20. Mourning clothes on top of that, bankruptcy. Women would dye their everyday dresses black, hoping it was adequate. Those who couldn't afford even that wore black armbands. Polite society considered this embarrassing degradation, appropriate only for soldiers. The poor couldn't even grieve correctly. Meanwhile, Courtaulds got richer off every death, every required wardrobe replacement. Not every woman embraced this quietly. During the Civil War, as Confederate men died in staggering numbers, Southern women abandoned full mourning within months. Economic necessity. They had children to feed. Stories survive of widows remarrying in their mourning clothes because there was no other choice. The system demanded performance of grief, but real grief, real life, didn't always cooperate. The rules were about control as much as respect, about keeping women visible in their suffering. World War I finished it completely. Too many widows, too many needed for war work. Factories, hospitals, every corner of the war effort. Seclusion became impossible. Crepe sales had already fallen 62% between 1883 and 1894. The war killed what remained. Courtauld survived by switching to coloured silks and eventually rayon patents in 1904. The mourning industry pivoted. The mourning system died with the war. 2 years of measured grief couldn't survive mass casualty reality. As you drift off tonight, think about what it means to perform grief, to wear loss like clothing, to have your sorrow measured, timed, judged by people who never knew what you lost. The Victorian widow wasn't just mourning her husband. She was mourning for a society that needed grief to be visible, categorized, controlled. The wedding went on without her. Dancing, white dress, flowers, all continued. While somewhere nearby, a woman in poisonous black crepe counted days until the world would let her belong again. Bleeding heart of history. Picture Victorian England as a place where death wasn't an occasional visitor, it was your next-door neighbour. Every family knew the sound of funeral bells, every woman owned black dresses. Because here's what we forget about the 1800s. People died constantly. Babies, children, healthy adults who caught something on Tuesday and were gone by Friday. This wasn't like today where death feels distant, clinical. Death lived in your house. And when it came for your husband, society had very specific plans for what happened next. Cholera outbreaks could wipe out entire neighborhoods in weeks. Tuberculosis, they called it consumption back then, would slowly hollow out a person over months. Scarlet fever took children so fast parents barely had time to say goodbye. Infant mortality, 1 in 4 babies didn't make it to their first birthday. So when I tell you that Victorian society was obsessed with death, I mean they lived it every single day. Every cough could be the start of something terrible. Every fever might be the last one. Then Prince Albert dies in December 1861. Queen Victoria loses her mind with grief. And I mean that literally. She goes into mourning so deep, so public, so theatrical, that the entire British Empire watches and takes notes. She wears black for the rest of her life. 40 years of black dresses. Her court follows suit. The etiquette manuals scramble to write down these new rules. And suddenly, mourning isn't just personal anymore. It's performance art, with very specific costume requirements. Here's where it gets brutal for widows. Lose a parent, mourn for 1 year. Lose a sibling, 6 months. Lose your husband, 2 full years minimum. 2 years of black clothes, black veils, black everything. 2 years of social exile. 2 years of proving to everyone around you that your love was real and your grief is appropriately dramatic. Because God forbid you seem too eager to rejoin the living. That would suggest unseemly things about your character. The rules were insanely specific. First year deep mourning, only Parramatta fabric, this dull silk wool blend that caught no light whatsoever, covered in crepe, which was basically torture fabric, stiff, scratchy, chemically treated to absorb every photon. 6-foot veils that hung over your face like a shroud. Even your underwear had to have black ribbons sewn on. Year 2, second mourning. You could lift the veil, add tiny trim details. Final months, half mourning. Grey, lavender, soft violet, allowed, maybe. Weddings were absolutely forbidden during deep mourning. Not just discouraged, forbidden. Because Victorians genuinely believed a widow carried death with her, like perfume. Her presence at a wedding would contaminate the happiness, threaten the couple's future, maybe even curse their fertility. This wasn't just etiquette. This was superstition, dressed up as propriety. The shadow of the grave still clung to her, and shadows don't belong at celebrations of new life. The bride's family would literally uninvite you. Want to know who got rich from all this grief? Court Alds, British company with a near monopoly on mourning crepe. 30% return on capital during their peak years. They exported suffering worldwide, developed cheaper versions for working class mourners, and here's the really sick part. They spread rumours that keeping crepe in your house after mourning ended was unlucky, so every death meant buying an entirely new wardrobe. Brilliant business model, absolutely diabolical ethics. The clothes were literally poisonous. Aniline black dyes mixed with arsenic, potassium dichromate, copper chloride. Women were getting arsenical poisoning from their grief uniforms. Medical journals in the 1880s documented respiratory damage from crepe particles. The mourning veil was called a veritable instrument of torture in hot weather. So you're dealing with the worst loss of your life, and society dresses you in toxic fabric that makes you physically sick. The cruelty is almost artistic. Working class widows were completely screwed by this system. A funeral could cost £5 when your annual salary was 20. Mourning clothes on top of that. Financial ruin. Poor women would dye their everyday dresses black, hoping it looked proper enough. Others wore black armbands, which polite society considered embarrassingly inadequate. Meanwhile, rich widows could afford silk and jet jewellery, professional mourning photographers, elaborate funeral monuments. Even grief had a class system. The whole thing started cracking during the Civil War. Too many Confederate women were widowed too fast. Economic necessity forced them back to work while still in mourning dress. Some remarried in their black clothes because survival trumped propriety. World War I finished the job entirely. When half of Europe was in mourning simultaneously, the system collapsed. Crepe sales dropped 62% between 1883 and 1894. Victorian mourning died with Victoria herself in 1901. Think about this as you drift off tonight. Imagine being asked to wear your heartbreak like a uniform, to let strangers measure your grief, time it, judge its authenticity based on fabric choices and social isolation. The Victorian widow wasn't just mourning her husband. She was performing mourning for a society that needed to control even sorrow. Somewhere in that performance was real love, real loss, but it was wrapped in so many rules that sometimes the grief got lost in the costume. Sweet dreams. Donning the shroud of seclusion. Picture this. You've just buried your husband. The funeral's over. Everyone's gone home. And now society hands you a rule book. Not for grieving, for dressing. Every single piece of clothing on your body, from your hat down to your underwear, had to follow strict regulations. Black Parramatta dress. No shine, no trim, no exception. This wasn't fashion. This was a uniform of sorrow. And breaking the dress code meant you didn't love your dead husband enough. The star of this mourning costume. Crepe. That scratchy, dull black fabric that absorbed every bit of light. Think of the roughest, most uncomfortable material you've ever worn. Crepe was worse. It was silk and wool, heavily chemically treated, crimped into stiff ridges that caught on everything. The goal was to look as miserable as you felt. And here's the thing, you had to cover your entire dress in this stuff. Head to toe darkness. Jewellery? Only jet. This dense black stone mined in Yorkshire became the widow's only acceptable decoration. No gold, no silver, no pearls, just jet brooches, jet earrings, jet rings if you could afford them. The jet industry exploded during Victorian mourning mania. Whitby, this little coastal town, became the mourning jewellery capital of Britain. Women would wear intricate jet pieces carved with weeping willows, hands clasping, flowers drooping downward. Even sadness had to be beautiful. The widow's veil deserves its own horror story. 6 feet of double-layered black crepe hanging from a matching bonnet. Over your face, down your back, so thick you could barely see through it. Godey's lady's book called it blinding and suffocating. Imagine trying to navigate stairs, pour tea, comfort your children, all while peering through this black fog. Some widows described it as living inside a thundercloud for an entire year. Here's how obsessive this got. Even your underwear wasn't safe. Victorian mourning manuals required black ribbon sewn onto petticoats, chemises, corsets, pieces of clothing no one would ever see, still had to announce your grief. Your stockings? Black. Your handkerchiefs? Black with black embroidered borders. They wanted your sorrow to touch every inch of your skin. Nothing could escape the mourning dress code. Nothing. Living in these clothes was misery. The crepe was stiff, scratchy, hot in summer, held moisture in winter. It made noise when you moved, that distinctive rustling sound that announced a widow's presence before she entered a room. Women complained of rashes, breathing problems, headaches from the weight of the veil. This wasn't just emotional suffering. The mourning costume was designed to make you physically uncomfortable. Grief made visible through actual pain. Rich widows bought expensive silk crepe, custom-fitted mourning dresses, full sets of jet jewellery. Poor widows, they dyed their regular clothes black, hoped it looked acceptable. Many couldn't afford even that. A working-class woman might wear a simple black armband, which polite society considered embarrassingly inadequate. The message was clear. If you couldn't afford to mourn properly, you didn't love your husband enough. Grief became a luxury good. One company got rich off all this sorrow. Courtaulds held basically a monopoly on crepe production. 30% return on capital during peak mourning years. They created Albert Crepe, a cheaper version for working-class mourners. They exported worldwide. Every death in Britain, America, France meant money in their pockets. They literally profited from grief, and they made sure to spread rumours that keeping old mourning clothes brought bad luck. Fresh tragedy, fresh wardrobe. Plot twist: the mourning clothes were poisoning women. The black dyes contained arsenic, potassium dichromate, copper chloride. Medical journals started documenting cases of arsenical poisoning from crepe dresses. Women developed respiratory problems from inhaling toxic particles, skin rashes from the chemicals, eye irritation from the veils. They were being slowly poisoned by their grief uniforms. The fashion magazines called mourning veils instruments of torture. They weren't exaggerating. The financial burden destroyed families. A working-class funeral cost £5 when annual salaries were £20. Mourning clothes on top of that. Bankruptcy. Women borrowed money, sold possessions, went into debt just to grieve properly. Some chose between feeding their children and buying mourning clothes. Society said if you couldn't afford the costume, you were dishonouring your dead husband's memory. Poverty made you a bad widow. World War I killed the mourning system. Too many widows, too many dead, too many women needed at work, not hidden at home in black veils. Crepe sales collapsed. Courtaulds pivoted to coloured silks, and survived. The elaborate mourning costume didn't. By 1920, most of these rules had vanished entirely. Women could finally grieve without performing their sorrow as a fashion show. The widow's uniform became a historical curiosity, thankfully. Imperial isolation. How funerals affected treasuries. Here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize Victorian mourning: the money. A working man's annual salary, £20. The cost of a decent funeral, £5. Just the funeral. Before you even think about the mourning clothes, the black-edged stationery, the jet jewellery, the crepe veils, before you consider that his widow now needs to dress like death itself for 2 solid years, and if she can't afford it, society will make sure she knows exactly what that means. Death wasn't just an emotional catastrophe in Victorian England, it was financial ruin wrapped in black silk. Think about it, your husband dies of typhus on a Tuesday. By Friday, you need a coffin, a burial plot, mourning clothes for yourself and the children, plus enough crepe fabric to drape every mirror and picture frame in the house. The undertaker's bill alone could eat 3 months of wages, and that's just the beginning. The real expense? The next 24 months of your life. Let me break down what death actually cost a Victorian family. Cheapest pine coffin, £2. Burial plot, another £1. Hiring mourners because you needed at least 6 people to carry the coffin properly, 10 shillings. Black armbands for male relatives, 5 shillings. And then there was the mourning feast, because apparently grief required catering. A modest spread for 20 people, £3 minimum. We're already at £7 total, more than a third of a working man's entire annual income, gone in 1 week. But funerals were just the opening act. The real financial nightmare was the mourning wardrobe. A proper widow needed at least 3 black dresses made from Parramatta silk. Each dress, 15 shillings. Black undergarments with mourning ribbons sewn on, another £1. The crepe veil alone cost 30 shillings. That's more than most people spent on clothing in an entire year. Jet jewellery, black gloves, mourning bonnet, special black-edged handkerchiefs. The list went on and on. Death had become a luxury industry. Working-class families faced an impossible choice. Follow mourning etiquette and go bankrupt, or break the rules and face social destruction. Most tried to find a middle ground. They'd dye their everyday clothes black with cheap ink that faded to brown within weeks. They'd wear a simple black armband instead of full mourning dress. They'd skip the expensive jet jewellery and make do with painted black wood. But here's the thing. Everyone could tell. The fabric was wrong. The cut was wrong. Everything about it screamed poor. Some women got creative with their mourning budgets. They'd borrow black dresses from neighbours, passing them around like tragic hand-me-downs. Others would buy one good black dress and wear it constantly for months, letting it fade and fray rather than spending money they didn't have. The luckiest had sisters or mothers who could sew, creating homemade versions of mourning clothes, using whatever black fabric they could afford. But even these compromises came with risks. Get caught cutting corners, and the gossips would pounce. The social pressure was relentless. Neighbours watched every widow like hawks, measuring the quality of her grief by the expense of her clothes. Too cheap and you didn't love your husband. Too elaborate and you were showing off. The perfect amount of visible suffering had to be maintained at all times. Church ladies would literally examine your dress fabric after services, whispering about whether that was proper Parramatta or just dyed cotton. Your grief had to be authentic, visible, expensive, and perfectly calibrated. No pressure at all, right? Meanwhile, the crepe industry was getting rich off all this mandated misery. Courtaulds Textile Company held a virtual monopoly on mourning crepe, earning 30% returns during peak mourning years. They even created cheaper versions like Alpert crepe for working-class mourners, ensuring every social class could participate in profitable grief. The company exported mourning materials worldwide, turning British sorrow into international commerce. Death, it turned out, was one of the most reliable industries of the 19th century. Everybody dies, everybody needs to mourn, everybody pays. For poor women, the mourning system created a cruel trap. You couldn't afford proper mourning clothes, but you couldn't afford not to wear them either. Breaking mourning etiquette meant social exile, lost job opportunities, and damaged marriage prospects for your daughters. Some women worked extra jobs just to buy mourning clothes, cleaning houses, or taking in laundry to afford the black dresses society demanded. Others went into debt, borrowing money they'd never be able to repay. Grief had become another way the poor stayed poor. The social scorning of women who couldn't afford proper mourning was vicious and systematic. They were whispered about in shops, excluded from church committees, and treated as moral failures rather than economic casualties. Their children were teased at school, Their friends distanced themselves. The message was clear: if you truly loved your husband, you'd find the money somehow. If you truly respected the dead, you'd sacrifice everything to dress appropriately. Poverty became proof of inadequate love. Financial struggling became moral failing. The cruelty was breathtaking. The whole system trapped families in cycles of debt and desperation. Death begat poverty. Poverty begat shame. Shame begat more debt, as families borrowed to maintain appearances. Some widows remained in mourning clothes longer than required simply because they couldn't afford anything else. Others remarried quickly, not for love, but because a new husband meant escape from mourning expenses they couldn't handle alone. The Victorian era turned grief into a luxury good, making sorrow itself another privilege of the wealthy. What a legacy to leave behind. The deadly fabric. Crepe and its hidden atrocities. Here's where this story gets really dark. All that black crepe we've been talking about, the fabric that wrapped Victorian widows in grief for 2 solid years, it was literally poisoning them. Not metaphorically, actually poisoning them. The dyes, the chemicals, the manufacturing process, it was all toxic. And the companies making this stuff knew it. They knew women were getting sick, losing their sight, struggling to breathe, but crepe was big business, huge business. So they kept quiet and kept selling. The main culprit was aniline black dye, developed in the 1850s from coal tar. Sounds innocent enough, right? Wrong. To get that deep, light-absorbing black that Victorian mourning demanded, manufacturers mixed coal tar with potassium dichromate and copper chloride. Both corrosive, both dangerous. And here's the kicker. They also added arsenic. Arsenic, the same stuff used to poison rats. Harvard professor Frederick Shattuck found that some aniline dyes contained up to 3% arsenic by weight. 3%. In fabric pressed against women's skin for hours every day. The symptoms started showing up in doctors' offices by the 1870s. Respiratory problems from inhaling tiny fabric particles, skin irritation and rashes, eye infections that could lead to partial blindness. In 1879, British surgeon Jabez Hogg documented a case that stopped everyone cold. A female patient suffering full arsenical poisoning from her black crepe dress. Not from eating something, not from drinking contaminated water, from wearing the clothes society demanded she wear to prove her grief was real. The dress was literally killing her while she mourned. Medical journals started sounding the alarm by the 1880s. The New York Medical Journal called out the respiratory damage from poisonous crepe particles. The Northwestern Lancet went further, calling the mourning veil a veritable instrument of torture in hot weather. Think about that. Women in the American South, wearing 6 feet of toxic black fabric in 90-degree heat, breathing through chemically treated crepe that burned their lungs. The fashion magazine The Delineator put it perfectly in 1895. The eyes that survived the bitterness of tears succumbed to the poisonous rasping of crepe. And who was getting rich off all this suffering? One company controlled almost everything, Courtaulds. They held what amounted to a monopoly on mourning crepe production. Between 1850 and 1885, they earned a 30% return on capital from crepe alone. 30%. That's enormous, even by today's standards. They exported worldwide, found huge markets in America and France. When working-class families couldn't afford the premium version, Courtaulds created a cheaper line called Albert Crepe. Different price points, same toxic chemicals, same profits from grief. But the real genius, and I use that word with complete disgust, was the disposal system. Crepe manufacturers and warehouses spread this superstition that keeping mourning clothes after the grieving period ended brought terrible luck. You couldn't store it. You couldn't pass it down. You definitely couldn't sell it. Every death in the family meant buying an entirely new, expensive wardrobe from scratch. Fresh profits from fresh grief. The companies literally turned superstition into a sales strategy. commercialized fear to maximize revenue. It's breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. For working class families, this was financial destruction. A working class funeral in the 1870s cost around £5. Annual salary, £20 if you were lucky. Now add mourning clothes on top of that expense. Families went bankrupt buying the proper grief uniform. Women would dye their everyday clothes black, hoping it looked acceptable. Those who couldn't afford even that wore black armbands which polite society considered embarrassingly inadequate. You were shamed for being too poor to poison yourself properly. The system was designed to extract money from desperation. The health effects got worse with extended exposure. Women wearing crepe for 2 full years weren't just dealing with occasional irritation. They developed chronic respiratory conditions, persistent skin problems, some lost vision permanently. The crepe was so heavily treated with chemicals that it couldn't breathe, couldn't bend naturally. It trapped heat and moisture against the body, creating perfect conditions for chemical burns and infections. Victorian widows were essentially wearing toxic waste as a demonstration of love. The fabric that was supposed to honour their dead husbands was slowly killing them. By the 1890s, some doctors were openly calling for boycotts of mourning crepe. They published case studies, wrote letters to newspapers, testified before health boards, but the social pressure was too strong. Women who refused to wear proper mourning clothes faced community judgment that could destroy their reputations, so they chose the poison over the shame. The companies knew this. They counted on it. Social conformity was more powerful than medical evidence. Fear of judgment trumped fear of actual physical harm every single time. The whole toxic system finally started cracking during World War I. Too many deaths, too many widows, too much evidence of harm. Court halls had to pivot their business model entirely. They survived by switching to coloured silks and securing patents for rayon production in 1904. Smart business move, but the mourning crepe industry, dead. Sales had already dropped 62% between 1883 and 1894 as public awareness grew. The war just finished the job completely. No one wanted to wrap their grief in poison anymore. What haunting is how long this went on. Decades of documented medical evidence. Decades of women getting sick, going blind, struggling to breathe. And the system kept grinding forward because grief made money, because social control was more valuable than human health. The Victorian mourning industry wasn't just about fabric and fashion. It was about turning human suffering into sustainable profit. And for 50 years, it worked perfectly, until finally, mercifully, the world moved on and left this particular cruelty behind. A widow's fair, unforgiving etiquette. Picture this. Your closest friend's wedding invitation arrives. The day she's talked about for years, but you're sitting at home in your black dress, knowing you cannot attend. Not because you're sick, not because you weren't invited, but because society decided the shadow of death still clings to you. Your presence at a celebration would contaminate it. This was reality for Victorian widows from the 1840s through early 1900s. The rules weren't suggestions, they were law. According to Victorian etiquette manual, Polite Society at Home and Abroad, a widow was forbidden from accepting any social invitation during her first year of mourning. Weddings, christenings, dinner parties, dances, all closed to her. The only permissible outings? Church and visits with close relatives in private homes. Breaking this rule wasn't just a social mistake, it was understood as something close to a curse. A woman in widow's weeds at a wedding brought death's shadow into hope itself. To understand why a widow couldn't watch her niece marry, you need to understand their world. Victorian England had death rates modern life has erased from daily experience. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis moved through cities without warning. A healthy husband could be dead within a week. Then Prince Albert died December 14th, 1861. Queen Victoria plunged into mourning, so absolute, so visible, her subjects couldn't help but follow. Her example became every household's rule. Black became law. Victoria was 42 when she lost her husband of 21 years. Her court wore black. Her household wore black. Etiquette manuals rushed to codify what had been custom into rigid, measurable system. A woman who lost a parent mourned 1 year, a sibling 6 months, a cousin 4 weeks, but a widow 2 full years divided into 3 stages of descending restriction. Each stage had its own dress code, social permissions, expected behaviour. The purpose wasn't just honouring the dead. First stage, deep mourning, lasted 1 year and 1 day, plain black dresses made of parramatta, covered in crepe, that stiff, scratchy fabric, treated to absorb no light whatsoever. Her bonnet, black. Her veil, 6 feet of double-layered crepe, so heavy Godey's Lady's Book admitted it was blinding and stifling. No jewellery except jet pieces. No social events. She was removed from public life entirely. Cassell's household guide stated plainly, she should neither accept invitations nor issue them. The wedding prohibition was both practical and deeply superstitious. Practically, a woman in full black was visual intrusion at any celebration. Her presence announced death in a room consecrated to new beginnings. But the superstitious dimension ran deeper. Victorians believed widows carried something of the grave still, an aura of the departed that hadn't dissipated. Bringing that aura into a wedding threatened the couple's happiness, fertility, even longevity. Death was contagious through proximity. Second stage, second mourning, lasted 9 months. Modest relief, slight fabric trim on black dresses, black silk instead of parramatta. She could lift her veil back instead of covering her face. Some private gatherings were permitted, though public celebrations remained forbidden. Third stage, half mourning, lasted 3 to 6 months. Finally, colours appeared, muted lavender, dove grey, soft violet. Only after nearly 2 years could she re-enter the social world that had continued without her. The crepe itself was made almost exclusively by one British company, Courtaulds. They held a mourning monopoly and profited enormously. During 1850 to 1885, Courtaulds earned 30% return on capital from crepe production alone. They exported internationally, finding success in America and France. A cheaper Albert crepe was developed for working-class mourners, but there was a darker scandal beneath the commercial one. The dyes were frequently toxic. Women were literally poisoned by grief uniforms. Aniline black dye was developed from coal tar, mixed with potassium dichromate, copper chloride, arsenic. Harvard professor Frederick Shattuck argued these dyes could contain 3% arsenic by weight. British surgeon Jabez Hogg documented a patient suffering arsenical poisoning from her black crepe dress. Medical journals raised alarms. The New York Medical Journal decried irritation from poisonous crepe particles. The mourning veil became a veritable instrument of torture. Eyes surviving tears succumbed to poisonous rasping. For working-class widows, the financial burden was devastating. A working-class funeral cost £5 when annual salary was £20. Mourning clothes on top could bankrupt families entirely. Women of limited means dyed everyday clothes black, hoping results were adequate. Those who couldn't afford even that wore black armbands, which polite society considered embarrassing degradation. Manufacturers perpetuated superstition that keeping crepe after mourning ended was unlucky, ensuring every death meant entirely new, expensive wardrobes. The whole system collapsed during World War I. Casualties were staggering. The army of widows vast. Victorian mourning structures couldn't hold. Women were needed in factories, hospitals, everywhere. Seclusion was impossible. Crepe sales had already fallen 62% between 1883 and 1894. The war finished it entirely. Courtaulds survived by pivoting to coloured silks. The mourning system died completely. Somewhere nearby, a woman in black had sat quietly, counting days until the world would allow her to belong again. Grief through gradations. Mourning stages unveiled. Picture this. Your husband dies on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, you're already measuring your life in stages. Full mourning, second mourning, half mourning, 2 years of your life mapped out like a prison sentence. Each stage with its own dress code, social permissions, and expected behaviour. This wasn't guidance, it was law. Victorian society had turned grief into a performance, complete with costumes, scripts, and an audience watching your every move for signs you might be grieving incorrectly. Stage 1 begins immediately. Full mourning, deep mourning. The names sound almost elegant until you're living them. 1 year and 1 day of complete social death, while you're still breathing. Everything you own turns black. Your dresses, your undergarments, your stationery, even the ribbon on your chemise has to be dyed black. The fabric they used? Crepe. Heavy, scratchy, light-absorbing crepe that made women sick from the toxic dyes. But fashion wasn't the point. Disappearance was. You become a ghost haunting your own life. Your days shrink to almost nothing. Church on Sundays, that's about it. Maybe visits with immediate family in their private homes. But dinner parties, theatre, weddings, forget it. You're not just uninvited. You're forbidden from accepting invitations at all. The etiquette guides were crystal clear. A widow in deep mourning doesn't enter society for minimum 3 months. Most stayed hidden for the full year. Imagine spending 12 months watching life happen through your window while wearing 6 feet of black veiling that's literally blinding and stifling. The rules weren't suggestions. They were published in every major etiquette manual, enforced by community judgment, and internalized by women themselves. Break them? You weren't just being rude, you were being indecent, immoral even. A woman who shortened her mourning period was essentially advertising sexual availability. That's how they saw it. Your grief had to be visible, measurable, and performed exactly right, or people would question whether your marriage had been real, whether your love had been genuine, whether your virtue remained intact. Then, after 1 year and 1 day, stage 2 arrives. Second mourning. The relief is tiny but real. You can lift your veil back over your head instead of covering your face. You can wear black silk instead of that horrible crepe. Maybe add some slight trim to your dresses. It's still black, all black, but it's different black, softer black. You might attend some private gatherings now, very private, very small, but public celebrations, still off limits. You're not ready for joy yet. Society will tell you when. 9 months of second mourning. 9 months of slowly, carefully edging back toward the world of the living. Your stationery still has black borders, but they're narrower now. Week by week, the margins shrink. It's like watching a countdown in reverse. Black borders getting thinner as you get closer to permission to exist again. You can receive some visitors, you can make some calls, but always in black, always quiet, always demonstrating that you remember your place in this hierarchy of sorrow. Finally, stage 3. Half mourning. After nearly 2 years, colours return to your world. Not bright colours, God no. Muted lavender, dove grey. Soft violet, colours that whisper instead of speak. You wear them with minimal ornamentation, as little jewellery as possible. Think of it like being slowly weaned back onto solid food after a long illness. Your eyes, accustomed to nothing but black for 20 months, probably need time to adjust to seeing purple again. This is where society finally gives you permission to hope. Half mourning lasts 3 to 6 months, depending on your age and circumstances. Young widows, they watched you more carefully, made sure you weren't rushing toward remarriage too eagerly. During this stage, you can finally accept some social invitations. Not all of them, not the big joyful ones, But quiet dinner parties with close friends? Maybe. A small tea gathering? Perhaps. You're testing the waters of normal life, seeing if you remember how to make conversation about something other than loss. The hardest part? Everyone's watching. Your neighbours, your friends, your family, they're all keeping track. Did she shorten her mourning by a week? Is that trim too decorative? Is she smiling too much at church? The performance of grief had an audience, and that audience had opinions. Women policed each other ruthlessly. A widow who stepped out of line wasn't just breaking etiquette, she was threatening the whole system. If one woman could grieve differently, what did that say about the rest of them? By the time you reach the end, 24 months later, you're a different person. Not because grief has changed you, that would have happened anyway, but because you've been trained, disciplined, taught that your feelings belong to society as much as they belong to you. You've learnt to measure emotion in fabric weight and colour depth. You've discovered that love can be legislated, timed, and graded like a school assignment. The woman who emerges from Victorian mourning knows exactly how much grief is enough. Here's what gets me about this whole system. It was sold as respect for the dead, honour for marriage, protection of virtue. But really, it was control. Pure and simple. Control over women's bodies, their movements, their sexuality, their choices. A widower wore a black armband for 3 months and got on with life. A widow disappeared for 2 years and emerged grateful for permission to wear purple. The stages weren't about grief, they were about power. And the woman inside, all that black crepe, she learned to mourn quietly. Superstitious shadows of Victorian society. Picture this. Your best friend's wedding invitation arrives, the day she's dreamed about for years, and you're sitting at home in your black dress, knowing you can't go, not because you're sick, not because you weren't invited, but because society decided the shadow of death clings to you so powerfully that walking into that church would contaminate the celebration. This was real life for Victorian widows. The rules weren't suggestions, they were published in etiquette manuals and enforced by an entire community. To understand why a widow couldn't watch her own niece get married, you have to understand Victorian death rates. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. They swept through cities without warning. A healthy husband could be dead within a week. Then Prince Albert died in 1861, and Queen Victoria plunged into mourning so absolute that her subjects had no choice but to follow. The etiquette manuals rushed to turn custom and superstition into rigid, measurable rules. And widows, they got the harshest treatment of all. The mourning system had 3 brutal stages. Full mourning lasted 1 year and 1 day. Second mourning, 9 months. Half mourning, 3 to 6 months. 2 full years of your life, measured out in fabric restrictions and social exile. A woman who lost a parent mourned for 1 year. A sibling, 6 months. But a widow, 2 years minimum, because apparently losing your life partner required the most public performance of grief society could devise. And wedding invitations during that time, absolutely forbidden. Full mourning meant only plain black dresses made of parramatta, covered in crepe, this scratchy fabric treated with chemicals so it absorbed 0 light. Even her underwear had black ribbons sewn on. Her veil was 6 feet of double-layered crepe, so thick that Godey's Lady's Book admitted it was blinding and stifling. No jewellery except jetstones, no social events. For an entire year, she was basically removed from public life. The Castle's household guide said she shouldn't accept invitations or issue them. Why were weddings specifically banned? Part practical, part superstition. Practically, a woman in full black was a walking announcement of death at a celebration of new beginnings. But the superstitious part runs deeper. Victorians genuinely believed widows carried an aura of the departed, something from the grave that hadn't dissipated yet. Bringing that energy into a wedding threatened the couple's happiness, their fertility, even their survival. The belief that a widow at a wedding brought bad luck was as real as it was unspoken. Here's what gets me about all this. One company basically monopolized grief. Court halls held exclusive control over crepe production. During the peak years of 1850 to 1885, they earned 30% returns on mourning fabric alone. They exported internationally, even developed cheaper Albert crepe for working-class mourners, an entire industry built on the requirement that women perform their sorrow in expensive, specific clothing. And here's the kicker. They spread superstitions about keeping crepe after mourning ended being unlucky. The crepe itself was literally poisoning women. The dyes contained arsenic, potassium dichromate, copper chloride, all toxic. By the 1880s, medical journals were sounding alarms. Harvard's Dr. Frederick Shattuck found aniline dyes could be 2 to 3% arsenic by weight. Women developed arsenical poisoning from their mourning clothes. The New York Medical Journal called crepe veils instruments of torture in hot weather. They were made physically ill by the uniform society demanded they wear to prove their grief was real. For working-class widows, this system was financial devastation. A working-class funeral cost £5 when annual salary was £20. Mourning clothes on top of that could bankrupt families entirely. Women would dye their regular clothes black, hoping it passed inspection. Those who couldn't afford even that wore black armbands, which polite society considered an embarrassing degradation, appropriate only for soldiers in uniform. Your grief had to be expensive to be considered proper grief. Meanwhile, men got a completely different deal. A widower wore a black armband for 3 months. That's it. He could work, remarry whenever, re-enter society on his own schedule. The double standard is staggering when you think about it. A woman's grief had to be performed publicly, continuously, expensively, for 2 full years. Her movements controlled, her social life eliminated, her very presence at celebrations considered contaminating, all while her male counterparts moved through the world essentially unchanged. The whole system collapsed during World War I. The casualties were so massive, the army of widows so enormous, that Victorian mourning structures simply couldn't hold. Women were needed in factories, hospitals, everywhere. Seclusion was impossible. Even before the war, crepe sales had fallen 62% between 1883 and 1894. People were already rejecting this performance of grief. The war just finished what changing attitudes had started. Courtauds survived by switching to coloured silks. The mourning system died completely. As you rest tonight, think about what it means to make grief visible. To wear your loss like clothing. Let it be measured and judged by people who'll never understand what you've lost. The Victorian widow wasn't just mourning her husband. She was performing mourning for a society that needed grief to be categorized and controlled. Somewhere nearby, a woman in poisonous black fabric sat counting days until the world would let her belong again. Sleep well, grateful for the freedom to grieve however you need to. Escaping the emotional prison. Here's what the etiquette books didn't account for. Real women with real problems who couldn't afford to grieve on society's schedule. Margaret Sheffield of Boston lost her husband in 1873 and showed up to her daughter's wedding 6 months later. Not in half-mourning lavender, in full black crepe, but she was there. The whispers followed her down the aisle. The stares burned through that heavy veil. But she walked her daughter to the altar anyway, because some things mattered more than proper mourning. The Sheffield story spread through Boston society like wildfire. How dare she? How could she risk cursing her own daughter's marriage? But here's the thing. The marriage lasted 43 years. So much for that death curse, right? Margaret's defiance wasn't isolated. Across America and Britain, cracks were showing in the mourning system. Women were quietly, carefully, finding ways around rules that threatened to bury them alive. They had to, because mourning was expensive, and isolation was deadly, and sometimes love meant showing up anyway. Take Sarah Morrison of Leeds, widowed in 1869, with 3 children under 10. The mourning rules said she couldn't work outside the home during deep mourning, couldn't accept social invitations, couldn't even visit friends without risking her reputation. But Sarah had mouths to feed, so she did what thousands of working-class widows did. She bent the rules until they broke, took in washing at night when neighbours couldn't see, sold preserves door to door, wearing a heavy black veil to hide her identity. Survival trumped propriety every time. The rural widows had their own rebellion. Out in farming communities, mourning clothes were impractical and expensive. Women couldn't afford to replace entire wardrobes for grief. So they improvised, dyed everyday dresses with whatever black dye they could find, wore simple black armbands instead of full crepe. The result? A patchwork mourning system where women followed the spirit of the rules while ignoring the letter. City society might judge, but distant neighbours understood. Necessity created its own etiquette, and that etiquette had room for common sense. Some women found loopholes in the system itself. Remember, the rules said widows couldn't attend social events. But what about family obligations? What about emergencies? Elizabeth Hartwell, of Philadelphia, attended her brother's funeral during her own deep mourning in 1875, technically breaking the social isolation rule. But who could argue with that? Death trumped etiquette. Slowly these exceptions multiplied. A sick grandchild needed nursing. A sister required help with childbirth. Women discovered that duty could excuse almost any breach of mourning protocol. The Civil War changed everything. With casualties mounting daily, the old mourning system simply couldn't hold. Too many widows, too much loss, too much work that needed doing. Southern women especially broke the rules out of sheer necessity. They couldn't afford 2 years of seclusion when farms needed managing and children needed raising. Confederate widows remarried in their mourning clothes, worked in their black crepe, attended family gatherings during deep mourning. The war made pragmatists out of everyone, and pragmatism had no patience for mourning etiquette. Even the wealthy found creative ways around the restrictions. They couldn't attend public weddings, but private ceremonies, family only, that was negotiable. Rich widows would slip into back pews during wedding ceremonies, heavily veiled, leaving before the reception, present but not participating, there but not seen. It was a compromise between duty and propriety. The bride got her beloved aunt at the ceremony. Society got to pretend the rules weren't broken. Everyone saved face, and slowly, gradually, the system learned to bend rather than break. The doctors started speaking up too. By the 1880s, medical journals were documenting what everyone could see. Isolation was making widows sick. Depression, anxiety, physical illness from toxic mourning clothes, and forced inactivity. Progressive physicians began prescribing social engagement during mourning, light exercise, fresh air, even carefully attendance at family gatherings. Medical advice that directly contradicted social etiquette. But health was harder to argue against than propriety. Science gave women permission to save themselves, and many took it. By the 1890s, mourning rebellion was almost fashionable. Women's magazines started publishing articles about sensible mourning and practical grief. The rigid 2-year system was being questioned openly. Some widows began shortening their mourning periods. Others modified their dress codes. A few brave souls attended weddings in half-mourning colours after just 1 year. Each small act of defiance made the next one easier. The collective courage of thousands of widows was slowly, steadily dismantling the emotional prison that had held them captive. What's remarkable is how many of these rebellions were quiet ones. Women who attended family weddings but stood in the back. Widows who shortened their mourning by a few months but told no one. Mothers who chose their children's happiness over society's approval. These weren't dramatic protests. They were small, careful acts of self-preservation. Women saving their own lives in the only ways they could. And collectively, Those small rebellions added up to something revolutionary: the right to grieve on your own terms. By World War I, the old system was dead. Too many widows to control, too much work to be done, too many women who had learned that survival mattered more than propriety. The rigid mourning rules that had imprisoned generations of women simply vanished. Not through legislation or official decree, but through a million small acts of defiance. Women who chose love over protocol, life over performance, their own healing over society's expectations. They broke the rules until the rules broke, and in breaking them, they set themselves free. Resilience unveiled. Necessity breaks tradition. April 1863. The Civil War is tearing America apart. And something else is breaking too. The elaborate mourning rules that controlled women's lives for decades. Picture this. A widow stands in a small church in Tennessee, wearing her black mourning dress, but she's not there to grieve. She's there to marry again. Her first husband died at Gettysburg 8 months ago. Society says she should mourn for 2 full years, but her 3 children are hungry, and survival doesn't wait for etiquette. The numbers were staggering. Over 600,000 men died in the Civil War. That meant hundreds of thousands of widows, most with children, most with no income. The Victorian mourning system worked when society was stable and families had money, but war changed everything. Women couldn't afford to buy new mourning clothes every few months. They couldn't sit in parlours for 2 years while their kids went without food. Reality was crushing the rulebook, one desperate decision at a time. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 26 years old, 3 children under 8. Her husband Thomas died at Antietam, leaving her with nothing but debt and a failing farm outside Nashville. For 6 months she tried to follow the rules, wore her black crepe, refused all social invitations, turned down help from neighbours because accepting charity meant admitting she couldn't manage alone. But by March 1863, her youngest was sick and she had no money for medicine. Something had to give. Enter James Carson, a neighbour whose own wife had died in childbirth the year before. He had a steady job with the railroad and no children. He'd been watching Sarah struggle, bringing food when he could, fixing things around her farm. It wasn't romance, it was arithmetic. She needed security. He needed someone to help run his household. And both of them were too practical to wait 18 more months while society decided they'd grieved enough. The proposal happened on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was trying to milk their one remaining cow when James knocked. "I have an idea," he said, "and you're not going to like it at first." He was right. The thought of remarrying in her mourning clothes felt like betrayal, like she was announcing to the world that Thomas hadn't mattered. But when her 6-year-old asked that night why they couldn't have meat like other families, the abstract shame of breaking rules lost to the concrete need of feeding children. April 12, 1863. The wedding that broke everything. Sarah walked into that little Presbyterian church, wearing her black Parramatta dress and crepe veil. No white dress, no flowers in her hair, just practical black silk and a man who promised her children wouldn't go hungry. The preacher hesitated. He'd never married a woman in mourning attire, but these weren't normal times. Half his congregation had buried husbands or sons. Normal was a luxury no one could afford anymore. The reaction was mixed. Older women whispered that Sarah was disrespecting Thomas's memory, that she was moving too fast, that proper grief couldn't be rushed. But younger widows, they watched carefully, because Sarah's children were eating regular meals now. They had warm coats for winter. They weren't the hollow-eyed kids begging for scraps anymore. And when your own children are hungry, other people's opinions about propriety start to sound pretty hollow themselves. Within 6 months, 3 more widows in their county had remarried while still technically in mourning. Then more the next year. The pattern spread across the war-torn South like wildfire. Women who would have waited 2 years in 1860 were remarrying in 8 months, some even sooner. The elaborate mourning industry, the crepe manufacturers, the specialized dressmakers, they watched their business collapse in real time. War had made their rules irrelevant. What's fascinating is how quickly society adapted. By 1864, even etiquette guides were quietly revising their rules. In times of national crisis, one manual noted delicately, the usual periods of mourning may be abbreviated. They were trying to save face while acknowledging what everyone already knew. The old system was dead. Women had discovered that survival mattered more than sentiment. And once you learn that lesson, you don't unlearn it. This wasn't just about mourning clothes. This was about women realizing they could make their own choices when the situation demanded it. Sarah Mitchell's decision to remarry in her black dress was revolutionary, not because it broke a rule, but because it proved rules could be broken, that women's judgment about their own lives might actually be more reliable than society's rigid expectations. That necessity could create its own kind of morality. Sarah lived until 1901. She and James had 2 more children and ran a successful farm. Her oldest son from her first marriage became a teacher. Her daughters learned that sometimes love looks like practicality, and that survival isn't shameful. By the time the Victorian era officially ended, the elaborate mourning system it created had already been killed by American pragmatism. Some traditions die in drawing rooms. Others die when mothers choose feeding their children over following rules. Crumbling palace of mourning. By 1917, something impossible was happening. Widows were showing up to work in munitions factories. Still wearing black, yes, but working, moving, living. The elaborate Victorian mourning system that had governed women's grief for 60 years was cracking apart like old paint. Not because people stopped caring about the dead, but because the dead were everywhere now. When 500,000 British men die in a single battle, when entire villages lose every man under 30, the old rules don't just break, they become absurd. The math was brutal and simple. If every war widow observed full mourning, if every mother who lost a son withdrew from society for a year, if every sister, every fiancé followed Victorian protocol, there would be no one left to run the country. Britain needed women in factories making shells, in hospitals tending wounded soldiers, driving ambulances, managing farms, keeping the postal service running. The 2-year mourning schedule that had seemed so reasonable in peacetime became a luxury no nation at war could afford. The Courtaulds Company, remember them? The crepe monopoly that had built an empire on grief. Their sales dropped 70% between 1914 and 1918. Not because people stopped dying, because people stopped buying the costume. Women were dyeing their everyday dresses black instead of purchasing expensive mourning wardrobes. Working-class widows were wearing black armbands to the munitions plant. The elaborate hierarchy of grief, parramatta, crepe, jet jewellery, measured seclusion, it all started looking like theatre nobody had time for anymore. Here's what really killed Victorian mourning though. It wasn't just the scale of death. It was the democracy of it. In earlier wars, officers died at lower rates than enlisted men. Upper-class families could maintain their mourning rituals, while working-class families buried their boys and kept working. But World War I killed everyone. Dukes' sons, factory workers' sons. The Somme didn't care about your accent or your address. When grief becomes universal, the performance of grief becomes impossible. Women started making their own rules. A war widow in Manchester might wear black for 3 months instead of 2 years. A mother in Glasgow might skip the crepe entirely, wearing a simple black dress to her factory job. The social enforcement that had kept Victorian mourning so rigid, the neighbours watching, the etiquette books prescribing exact behaviours, it all fell apart when everyone was grieving simultaneously. There wasn't enough energy left to police each other's sorrow. Survival took priority over propriety. The government actually encouraged this shift. British authorities realised that national morale couldn't survive if half the population withdrew into black seclusion. Official propaganda began emphasising productive mourning, the idea that the best way to honour the dead was through continued service to the living. Work became a form of memorial. A munitions worker making shells was honouring her dead husband more meaningfully than a woman sitting at home in expensive crepe. The logic was brutal but effective. New rituals emerged to replace the old ones. Instead of 2 years in black, families held single memorial services. Instead of elaborate mourning jewellery, women wore simple lockets with photographs. Instead of withdrawing from society, war widows formed support groups. These weren't formal organisations at first, just women meeting in church basements or each other's kitchens, sharing practical advice about survivor benefits and childcare. Grief became communal instead of solitary, social instead of secretive. The medical profession started speaking up too. Doctors who had watched women literally sicken themselves with toxic mourning clothes began advocating for simpler approaches to grief. The British Medical Journal published articles arguing that prolonged seclusion was psychologically harmful, that fresh air and purposeful work aided recovery from loss better than darkened rooms and social isolation. Science was finally catching up to what many women had suspected all along, that Victorian mourning was more about control than healing. By 1919, it was over. Not officially, there was no government proclamation ending Victorian mourning, but culturally, socially, practically, the system had collapsed. Department stores stopped dedicating entire floors to mourning wear. Etiquette books began advocating for sensible mourning periods of 3 to 6 months maximum. The crepe industry pivoted to coloured fabrics or went out of business entirely. Women who had spent 4 years proving they could work, lead and contribute while grieving weren't about to return to performative seclusion. What replaced it was something more human. Grief became private again, which seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. A widow could mourn for as long as she needed, in whatever way felt authentic to her relationship with the deceased. Some women chose long periods of reflection, others remarried quickly. Both choices became socially acceptable. The idea that society could time and measure and dictate the proper performance of loss that died in the trenches, along with everything else from the old world. The palace of mourning crumbled because it was built on a foundation that couldn't survive industrial-scale death. When loss becomes universal, grief becomes honest. The elaborate Victorian system had served many purposes, controlling women, creating profitable industries, providing social structure around tragedy. But it hadn't actually served the grieving. The war taught everyone something simple and terrible and freeing. That mourning belongs to the mourner. That love doesn't require costume. That the dead are honoured by how the living choose to live. Sleep well. Reflection. Love, loss, and legible grief. Here we are at the end of our journey with Victorian widows. 2 years of mandatory mourning, 2 years of black crepe and social isolation, 2 years of making grief visible to satisfy society's need for control. But what did it all mean? Tonight, as we close this story, I want you to think about something. The woman who couldn't attend her friend's wedding wasn't just mourning her husband. She was performing mourning for everyone else. Picture her for a moment, sitting in her parlour while the wedding bells ring down the street. The crepe veil heavy on her shoulders, her skin irritated from the arsenic-laced dyes. She's not just grieving, she's demonstrating grief, making it legible, acceptable, measurable. The Victorian mourning system wasn't really about honouring the dead. It was about controlling the living, about making sure a woman's sorrow looked exactly the way society expected it to look. And the irony? All this elaborate grief theatre was supposed to be about love, about showing the world how much she cherished her departed husband. But love doesn't follow a timeline. Real grief doesn't wear the same black uniform for everyone. Some women needed more than 2 years, others needed less. Some grieved loudly, others quietly. The system had no room for any of that complexity. It demanded conformity from the most personal experience imaginable. The wedding prohibition tells the whole story, really. Death couldn't contaminate joy. Sorrow couldn't share space with celebration. A widow's shadow might somehow curse a bride's happiness. Think about the cruelty of that belief, that grief was contagious. That loss was something you carried on your skin like a disease, that your presence alone could poison someone else's future. It reduced human emotion to superstition, complex feelings to simple fear. But here's what gets me about these women. Many of them found ways to resist. Confederate widows during the Civil War abandoned mourning early out of necessity. Working-class women dyed their everyday clothes black because they couldn't afford proper mourning attire. Some remarried while still in their widow's weeds because survival mattered more than etiquette. Even within this suffocating system, human adaptability found a way. Love found a way. The companies that profited from all this structured sorrow, courtauds made fortunes selling toxic crepe. Funeral directors expanded their businesses to include mourning consultations. Fashion magazines published detailed guides on proper grief attire. An entire economy built on loss, on the requirement that women perform their pain visibly, expensively for years on end, while widowers wore a simple black armband for 3 months and got on with their lives. The medical evidence about poisonous mourning clothes adds another layer to this story. Arsenic in the dyes, respiratory problems from crepe particles. Women literally made sick by their grief uniforms. Dr. Frederick Shattuck's research showed mourning crepe could contain 3% arsenic by weight. The Northwestern Lancet called mourning veils instruments of torture, so even the physical act of grieving properly was harmful. Even the clothes designed to honor love were dangerous. What strikes me most is the loneliness. Imagine losing your husband and then losing your community too. No dinner invitations, no social calls, no celebrations to attend, just you, your grief, and a society that demanded you display it correctly while keeping it at arm's length. The Victorian widow was simultaneously hyper-visible in her black clothes and completely invisible in social spaces, present but not allowed to participate. The system finally collapsed during World War I. Too many widows, too much death, too much need for women in factories and hospitals. The elaborate mourning codes simply couldn't survive that scale of loss. Courtauds pivoted to coloured silks and rayon production. The crepe warehouses closed. Women stepped back into the world, wearing whatever they chose. And somehow, the dead were still honoured. Love persisted without the costume. So what's the legacy of all this? The Victorian mourning system was both a love story and a control story, wound so tightly together it's hard to separate them. It recognised that grief is real, powerful, deserving of time and space, but it also insisted that grief follow rules, that love be performed, that loss be measured and timed and approved by strangers. The tension between honouring feelings and controlling them, that tension still exists today. As our story ends, picture that Victorian widow one more time, sitting alone while life continues around her. The wedding she couldn't attend is over now. The bride has gone home happy, and slowly, quietly, the widow is learning something the system never taught, that grief has its own timeline. That love doesn't need a uniform. That healing happens in private moments, not public performances. Rest well tonight, grateful for the freedom to feel however you need to.